Every human culture has a set of creation myths, but they're in the realm of mythology or religion or folklore, and they are, of course, all mutually inconsistent.
Hi Ali, and anyone else who cares to watch. This is my first go at doing a critique. I hope you don't mind, but I've used clips from your original video for clarity's sake. Ideally, I'd like this to open up a respectful discourse between you and myself, but I suppose that I shall have to accept that there may be trolls on both sides. I shouldn't really have to say this, but for clarity's sake, for anyone watching, I will. Everything that I say that follows is my opinion. From my point of view, what I say runs the gamut from that which is purely opinion, because it can only be opinion, albeit carefully considered, through to that which I hold to be self-evident truth, due to the available evidence. I respectfully ask that you consider what I have to say with the due care that I use to come up with it, and reject if you find it unworthy of you. Further, I would ask that if you think it unworthy of me, that you let me know, along with your reasoning, obviously, so I can do the same. Anyway, on with the critique.
Many contemporary atheists have this mantra about evidence in God's existence. The same thing they keep saying over and over and over again. There is no evidence for God, therefore it is irrational to believe in God. Or they constantly ask that theists provide evidence for the existence of God, else they're not worthy of listening to. Now, I do believe that there are good reasons and sufficient justification for belief in God. However, I don't feel that it's necessary to give them.
That's fine, Ali, don't. But also don't call into question anyone else's beliefs, or lack thereof, ever. If you have good reasons and sufficient justifications, then give them, otherwise it's a baseless assertion, and even because it feels right is a better answer. I would anticipate that your reasons and justifications for belief don't stand up to evidence or reason, because that's not where they come from. I'd go so far as to say that because it feels right is a pretty good description of where it comes from, wouldn't you say? There is an increasing amount of evidence showing exactly which psychological phenomena combine to give one godly feelings and experiences of the divine.
And many atheists might be asking me, well, why do you think that?
Uh-huh.
Well, I have two reasons for that, one of them being minor and the other major. The first reason, the minor one, has more to do with how atheists view evidence and what I consider to be unreasonable demands. Most contemporary atheists follow this idea that evidence or sufficient justification is only found in science. In other words, if the purported evidence is not detected by the five senses, it's not sufficient.
There is actually a difference between evidence and empiricism, and science doesn't solely rely on the latter to provide the former. Sometimes science draws inferences from what can be apprehended, sure, but sometimes science draws inferences from a lack of something that should be there given the known interplay between those things that are available to the senses: ultraviolet light and infrared light, subsonic and hypersonic and even audible but not visible sound waves, black holes, dark matter. It's a long list. And on a side note, five senses? What about thermoreception, proprioception, equilibrioception? But I digress. To answer your question, no, evidence isn't only found in science. How about law, forensic accounting, history, and just the day-to-day information and deductions that we use to get by? Sometimes we call it knowledge.
Whether knowledge is so loose weave of a morning when deciding whether to leave her apartment by the front door or the window on her second floor.
In fact, we can only genuinely call something knowledge if it comes to us with evidence. Without evidence, it's faith.
Many contemporary atheists will then say that this non-material entity, God, must then therefore be proven by physical evidence.
I agree, many atheists do, and to an extent, so do I. I get that the God you postulate is non-material and supernatural and so defies all direct testing, which, you'll admit, is mighty convenient for the burden of proof, and if something can only be experienced, then it's harder to test. In fact, you'd have it so that it's completely unfalsifiable. Unfortunately for this standpoint, all Abrahamic religions have claimed God's hand in our physical world, so there should be inferential evidence of she, he, its existence. Another alternative would be monitoring the brain activity of believers. A study in 2009, linked below, showed that believers' brains on fMRI light up almost exactly the same way when asked about their opinion and God's opinion. This was on everything from abortion to the death penalty to Iraq to marijuana legislation. Different areas lit up when asked about the opinion of the average fellow American or George Bush. It was 2009. And does that imply that George was a below-average American? I think yes. Now, before you say, of course people will believe that they believe the same as God. It was further found that reasoning about God's beliefs activated areas associated with self-referential thinking, more so than did reasoning about another entity's beliefs. To quote Epley, the study's author, with a couple of additions for clarity, this research suggests that unlike an actual moral compass, inferences about God's beliefs may instead point people further in whatever direction they are already facing.
Anybody see the problem yet?
Problem? There are numerous claims of God having physically interacted with the world, so why wouldn't there be evidence? The problem I see is that you're either denying elements of your own faith's ideas about God's physical interaction with the world in order to get out of having to allow that there really is no evidence, or you're implying that she, he, it deceptively wiped down the fingerprints and swept away the footprints.
But how can physical evidence prove something that's not physical?
Tablets of stone? Physical. The parting of the Red Sea? Physical. The raising of Enoch into heaven? Physical. It's another long list. Oh, and I don't know whether you identify with this story, Ali, but the earthquake and blacking out of the sun at the time of Jesus' resurrection. Physical and cosmological and historically absent despite the number of people affected, and that includes the ruthlessly efficient administrators and record keepers in the Roman Empire.
When I hear many atheists suggest this, that I need evidence for the existence of God, I think they're just playing word games, because to them, it's not possible.
Yes, we believe it's not possible, which is consistent with our position. How is that a word game exactly?
So essentially they're just poking fun at theists and trying to act open-minded, rather than actually being that.
Wow, that's a good point. Let me think for a bit. Oh wait, my mistake, that's absolute bullshit. Science adjusts its views based on what's observed. Faith is the denial of observations so that belief can be preserved.
If you believe in pseudoscientific and supernatural concepts, that's your privilege. If you want to put forward your personal reasons for believing in them, understanding that whoever's listening may have questions or find flaws in your arguments, that's fine. But if you're in the habit of targeting individuals you've never met and suggesting they're in some way deficient just because they don't believe in these concepts, if you reject conflicting evidence and counter-arguments without consideration, but demand that others accept your arguments and what you regard as evidence uncritically, not only is that closed-minded, it's controlling, arrogant, and presumptuous in the extreme. More importantly, when you're trying to make it seem unreasonable for someone to want evidence before changing a significant attitude or take a significant risk, the mere fact that your claim requires a suspension of critical thinking should indicate it's not the other person that needs to demand less evidence, but you that needs to demand more. Before presuming to advise others to be open-minded, think about some of the widely accepted ideas you dismiss without consideration. You might need the advice you're dispensing far more than other people. Remember too that an open mind that demands little or no evidence for ideas before accepting them will let in an awful lot of rubbish.
Acting open-minded? You're aware of the yardstick for belief, evidence. If you can't meet that requirement, why have the discussion? Is it because you are acting open-minded? If you provide evidence for your belief, then, by rights, we would have to test the evidence and, if found to be irrefutable, accept the evidence. That said, just as all science is open to being refined or rejected by subsequent tests and evidence, so your evidence will be subject to the same rigour. It's not actually our fault that you lack evidence, empirical or otherwise, for your belief. If that lack of evidence saddens you, then you know what you have to do.
And some atheists may suggest that indirect physical evidence could prove the existence of a non-material entity. However, I really don't think this to be the case.
As previously stated, indirect material evidence should abound given God's purported heavy-handed influence in times past.
I mean, some of us out there have heard this claim that since God does not heal amputees, therefore there is no evidence to suggest that he exists.
The amputees thing is given as an example because limbs do not grow back, whereas cancers do go into remission and cataracts do reduce, and so on. It's a nice, simple, eminently achievable act for a deity. You'd think, why does God only act as health insurance for otherwise able-bodied people?
Well, even if an amputee actually did miraculously grow their limbs back, I'm pretty sure that most atheists would try to say that there's some sort of physical explanation behind it.
I'm sorry, but asserting what you believe atheists would say is not an argument. Sure, many atheists would be extremely resistant to it, just as you are resistant to our assertions about your contentions, which just goes to show how all-embracingly human that behaviour is. If, however, it did occur and had a proper case history so that any possibility of fakery was excluded, then it would be pretty incontrovertible. Well, that is until stem cell research gets more traction. Then your golden hope will be gone because man will be able to heal amputees and your God won't. Bear in mind also that we're now turning skin cells into brain cells without even needing stem cells, so God's time is limited. Link to that story below. It's interesting to note that Jesus healed the lame and lepers and all manner of other maladies that can be faked for the credulous or simply misdiagnosed by the layperson, but he never tackled amputees. Why is that, do you suppose?
And they would refrain from making any sort of supernatural claims because they believe that there is a natural explanation behind it. In other words, naturalism of the gaps.
Naturalism of the gaps? Cute. Ridiculous, but cute. Yes, the great thing about science is that it accepts the gaps and tries to find answers, as opposed to being afraid of the gaps and inserting an all-purpose filler, aka God or Allah. Saying I don't know is not an admission of failure. Saying God did it is. Proactively looking for gaps in our knowledge to supply naturalistic answers is entirely different from reacting to gaps and plugging them. You've merely confirmed an existent normative natural bias rather than increasing the sum of your knowledge. What's the point?
If it's not explained now, it will be explained later. And especially with the advent of quantum physics, well, anything can happen, right? In other words, I don't take the claim that God requires evidence seriously.
It's your life, Ali. Shouldn't it be based on something a bit more substantial than Aesop's fables and a funny feeling in your head? You probably put more mental effort into deciding who cuts your hair and which video camera and editing software you use. You put a lot of effort into justifying the decision already made rather than making the decision based on all available information, it seems.
Because I don't believe that atheists are being serious when they ask this question. And I don't even believe that most of them have ever sincerely questioned the foundations of their own epistemology or theory of knowledge.
Again with an unfounded assertion, but this time about the foundations of atheists' unbelief. There's no doubt that some atheists don't have a strong epistemology, but that's hardly the preserve of atheism now, is it? Did you happen to see the last Pew report? It showed that atheists, in the US at least, have a better understanding of religion than the religious do. Now admittedly Muslims weren't polled, being such a small minority in the US. Epistemologically, atheists tend to be more knowledgeable about the available options, not less. In the words of Albert Einstein, when you understand why you don't believe in other people's gods, you will understand why I don't believe in yours. Given that most, if not all, holy texts are internally inconsistent, logically incoherent, and fail to demonstrate the slightest evidence of the oft-claimed foreknowledge, atheism is by far the most sensible default state, because few ideas based on incorrect information have real-world value. Even if it's only your God that I don't believe in, I can justify that stance with exactly the same book you base your belief on, in much the same way that you don't believe in every other God hypothesis out there. Not living by a book that is incongruent, even if you live by no other written rules whatsoever, is more sensible. You'll notice that many atheists will assert an underpinning of secular humanism or skeptical metaphysical naturalism or similar. In other words, a lot of thought has gone into the adoption of the atheistic position, and that atheism is consistent with their worldview, not the other way around. Given that 40+% of US Catholics are unaware of the miracle of transubstantiation, a key tenet of their faith, and that most Muslims maintain the faith they were born into, it's fair to suggest that those of faith cannot claim the level of rigour that most atheists can.
Because if everything requires physical evidence, well, we're screwed.
I'm pretty sure that only theists would be screwed. That is, until some evidence comes forth.
Because most of the things we believe in aren't backed by physical evidence. Even the belief that everything requires evidence cannot be backed by evidence.
Evidence is necessitated by logic, and both logic and evidence show their value by allowing us to describe and predict the world in a way that works. Here's an example of how logic works with regard to evidence. I go to street vendor A for food. Later that night, I'm sick. I go to street vendor B for food. Later that night, I'm not sick. I go back to street vendor A for food. Later that night, I'm sick again. The evidence suggests that I shouldn't go to takeaway place A for food. Every time I derive a useful rule for my continued existence based on evidence, it is also evidence that using evidence works, evidently. And before you say it, it's not a closed system. It allows new information in, so it's not circular reasoning, even though it's a cyclical process. As with science, nothing is ever proven, but confidence in any other method asymptotically approaches zero with each cycle. It is a framework which, amongst other things, gave rise to philosophy. You know, the very thing you're studying. Where would philosophy be without logically derived axioms? Axioms themselves are based, at some point in their past, or the past of their contributory axioms, on evidence.
Note my video, Atheism Not the Default Position, for a full philosophical critique of the presumption of atheism.
You know, Ali, I gave that a look, and honestly, it's beneath you to have it up, and beneath me to answer it, but I'll be happy to critique it if you think I'm just posturing here.
My major gripe, however, with this claim or this question that do you have evidence for God's existence, is that it's completely nonsensical, given the fact that the normative natural disposition is to believe in the supernatural.
Right, now we get to the nub of your argument. It's our normative natural predisposition to believe that heavier objects fall faster than light objects. As you know, Galileo proved this wrong. Presumably our normative natural predisposition came from primitive man being more inclined to get out of the way more quickly for larger objects, a survival mechanism. It's our normative natural predisposition to follow authority figures, even when it means doing something unethical or immoral. And the more witnesses to a rape or murder in progress, the less chance that anyone will step in to stop the rape or murder from happening, known as the bystander effect or diffusion of responsibility. It's the normative natural predisposition to be rubbish at estimating any number of things, often to our detriment: agenticity, pareidolia, apophenia, ratios, and our own emotions in the future, for example. It's the normative natural predisposition to adhere to in-groups and to punish out-groups on the flimsiest pretexts. No, transcending our normative natural predispositions is what life is actually about. We should be striving to not be a slave to a repurposed hunter-gatherer brain and nervous system.
Now, what do you mean by that, Ali?
Condescending much?
Though what I and others have presumed for quite some time, though it has just recently been proven by scientific inquiry.
Wait, so now scientific inquiry is useful? The evidence-based approach to gathering information and deriving logical conclusions from that which is observed, now it's okay? Cherry-picking at its finest.
Is that we, as human beings, generally, are hardwired to believe in the supernatural.
Not hardwired, no. That would get us into a debate about free will versus determinism. Some other time, maybe. We are predisposed, certainly.
More precisely, we're hardwired to be dualist and to see agency and purpose around us. It's essentially part of our basic programming. The same basic programming that is foundational to scientific inquiry.
Whilst trying to find the basis, or rather the mechanism of agency in things may have started the ball rolling for science, I'll grant that, scientific inquiry is in some ways the denial of our hardwiring. Science requires that someone else observe the same thing I'm observing so that my own personal biases, normative natural predispositions, don't get in the way. The scientific method is very nearly the exact opposite of what we would do otherwise. Or, to put it another way, as I have recently, as a species, working together, each compensating for the other, we find the ultimate expression of humanity, science, using our collective strength to overcome our individual failings.
Islam has already promoted this sort of idea since the beginning, in what is called the fitra, or the natural disposition of mankind. So the idea that I have to somehow give evidence for something that I'm already predisposed to believing seems to me to be rather ludicrous. Allow me to explain why. My perception of reality in total is what allows me to live and to understand things. And part of that perception includes my interpretation of the external world. I'm essentially limited to seeing the world as I'm programmed to, because I have no other tools in which to perceive it. I see cause and effect, I see certain colors, I see certain sizes or shapes, etc., etc. And I also happen to see intention and agency and sort of a dualistic view of the world.
Which just goes to show, Ali, that you're not prone to realism at all. You're prone to perceptionism as part of your apperception, which is interesting because that's a form of empiricism. You're not forced to believe anything. You can choose to stick with what seems like the easy answer, or you can ask some questions of the universe with a bit of help from a few unbiased or counter-biased friends and see what you can discover. To quote your own profile page, the seeking of knowledge is obligatory for every Muslim.
And this is simply what I'm forced to believe based on what my psyche allows.
The previously mentioned scientific method is a paradigm shift. You can change your programming or psyche if you choose to, or you can let your normative natural predisposition run, or is that ruin, your life. It is exactly this attitude which kept us in the Dark Ages for so long. Getting real answers to real questions is a much better vector for knowledge than putting your hands up and saying, sorry, I'm just an ape with an ego, a monkey in shoes, I can't transcend my lowly existence, pity poor me.
Because this is all I have. There's no other tools in the toolbox. I mean, this is what we get.
Yes, this is what we get individually. Another tool that we get in our toolbox is socializing with other humans. We are in fact predisposed to seek out company, and not just for sex. If you haven't experienced the joy of being challenged intellectually by someone you admire, then your life is the poorer for it.
So when an atheist tells me that I need evidence for the existence of God, or ask me for evidence for the existence of God, for all of you out there who have been to a major city or live in a major city, I don't know if you've had this experience, but I've had it several times. Did you ever have one of those homeless guys walk up to you who's obviously had a bit too much to drink or too many drugs, and he starts going on about how this isn't the real world and that, you know, we're actually like in some sort of matrix world or your brain's in a vat or something like that? And they have this grand idea that somehow everything around us is an illusion, you know, and if you take the right drugs, somehow you'll see the reality.
Hang on, you're doing philosophy. Isn't the study of the nature of reality kind of your thing? Unfortunately for your argument, there is not necessarily a functional difference between the homeless guy whose mind is addled and your belief that only what your mind is predisposed to interpret is true. You are assuming causal correlation between his apparently intoxicated state and his belief about the nature of reality. What if he is predisposed to believe that, and it is only through alcohol or drugs that he can A, live with his concept, and or B, summon the Dutch courage to try and explain it to other people? Some would call that proselytizing. How do you know that he's not clinging to chemical intoxicants for his relative sanity in much the same way you're clinging to conceptual intoxicants for yours?
And though the story was not always the same, you know, it always had different details, the basic idea was essentially still there. And my first reaction to this sort of claim was that the person was a little bit not there. Because to me, if you question the basic perceptions that we have uninhibited, you are essentially also questioning what is evidence to begin with.
How do you know that what the homeless guy was expressing to you wasn't what he perceived uninhibited? Do you have the slightest clue about the idea of qualia and the fact that what we perceive about the world around us is essentially unique and personal? It just happens that through language we manage to find an equilibrium of sorts, a democratization, a commonality of understanding as to the nature of a jointly perceived reality. But the nature of reality as we individually perceive it will always be personal. Anyway, when you're questioning what evidence is and why we should even use it a few minutes ago, now evidence has truth value?
So to claim that there's an alternate reality outside of what we can perceive is rather ludicrous.
What, you mean like the supernatural? I agree.
I mean, when I walk down the street, I don't expect to, you know, fall through the earth and end up in some sort of alternate dimension. You know, or when I walk outside and I see a tree, I don't expect it to be something other than a tree unless there's some sort of data that tells me otherwise. What I initially perceive or understand is there to me, until of course an anomaly takes place. I have absolutely no reason to question something unless I have a reason to question it.
You have no reason to question something until you have reason to question it. Brilliant. And it's that thinking that gets in the way of the scientific inquiry that you were so happy to invoke back at 3 minutes 53 in your original video. The reason to question something would be contradicting, say it with me, evidence. What you've effectively said is that evidence is necessary except when it comes to God. Bear in mind that what you were talking about was an inquiry into the nature of the human mind. By your logic, what possible reason would we have to question the nature of the human mind in its normal state? I'll tell you, because if we don't benchmark what normal is, and that's an average across the population, we can't know what abnormal is. As individuals, we can't tell what constitutes abnormal in our own mind if our personal change from normal to abnormal is gradual. The descent into madness affects your apperception such that the delusions become normal, and you can't know what is normal as most others see it. One man's normal is another man's madness.
And what many contemporary atheists want you to believe is that we're born in this world questioning everything in such a way that we assume that what's there is not really there.
No, we're far more interested in finding out how what's really there really works, how it may be used elsewhere, and how it got to be really there in the first place. It's part of our normative natural predisposition, as you said yourself at 4 minutes 12 in your original video, looking for agency. Trying to prove that it's really there in the first place is philosophy, which is what you're studying.
In other words, they're like the homeless guy on the street telling you that everything is an illusion. So, in my mind, who's the one that's more rational here? Who's the one who's really going through some sort of cognitive dissonance?
Ooh, cognitive dissonance. Do you know how cognitive dissonance works?
Because it's not me or the majority of the world. If our normative disposition is to believe in the supernatural, then this idea that all we can know is the natural, or that there is no evidence for God, and that it's irrational to believe in God or the supernatural, is really the more irrational belief.
So the answer is no, you don't know how cognitive dissonance works. All we can know is the natural. You said that it is our predisposition to believe in the supernatural. Believe, not know. So you have a belief in the supernatural, but all you can sense is the natural world. Cognitive dissonance theory suggests that you need to modify what you believe or how you interpret what you see so that the two are congruent and no longer in conflict. Do you know how you most likely do that? By attributing even more to God and the supernatural than you are already predisposed to do, imbuing clearly natural things with supernatural agency, so your default state becomes self-referential and your very own personal cognitive bias. As such, you have indeed moved beyond the normative natural predisposition that you have. Sorry, I would respectfully suggest that you have done so in the wrong direction.
It is quite possible that default positions are more on the individual level. However, I would say that what is normative is more rational than what is not.
Normative does not imply rational, as has been repeatedly pointed out. What is normative was evolved on the plains and deserts and hills and woodlands over the last 150,000 years or so. Much of what was evolved there has become excess baggage over the last 150 years. For example, we crave the sugars and fats that drove us to pick fruit and kill animals for food, but now it just makes many of our species obese. It is normative to seek out others like us, to extend our in-group, to homogenize those directly around us so we can hegemonize everyone else. We do this so that we can either reinforce each other in our shared beliefs or correct each other's incorrect beliefs. It is then the basis of that belief that becomes the issue. Written communication, be it millennia old or milliseconds old, is the newest addition to our normative toolbox. We are predisposed to ascribe too much agency and authority to writing. It's written down, so it must be true. Your predisposition is to believe in the centuries-old tradition because it's also normative to believe that things were better in the past, which is demonstrably untrue. Mine is to follow where the evidence leads to the future.
And for many atheists who continue to use this baby analogy to assume that atheism is a starting point, this is just dumb.
Dumb? Ooh, snappy rhetoric. To again quote your profile, condemnation without investigation is the height of ignorance. Einstein. The baby thing was only ever brought up to illustrate the point that the default starting position is lack of belief. Now I know you want to say that we're hardwired to believe, and so on, but until a child's cognitive abilities are significantly more developed, it's not possible for a child to believe in a God, in and of and for itself. As you've effectively said, it will need to have well-developed language faculties before it can be told the good news, let alone accept it.
It is about as functional in dialogue and justification for rationality as stating that when I didn't exist, I didn't believe in God, so therefore I must be more rational than you. No.
Do you think that all atheists are English or something? To be clear, I do actually live in England, but I'm from New Zealand. You're misapplying the baby analogy, as pointed out previously, and I certainly wouldn't use it to point out I'm more rational than anyone. Failing to understand it, however...
Really?
Yes, really.
I mean, we're really trying to have a starting point, a starting position, based on a being that hasn't even developed their faculties to the point of even, understanding the world this way at all? I mean, when I was very young, I saw the world as purposeful or having some sort of intention or agency.
Yes, you did. That's perfectly normal, as is assuming supernatural powers of your parents.
I mean, when somebody told me about God for the first time, the only thing that I learned new was a word and a label to apply to what I already saw.
Supplying a name to the natural artifacts of a developmental stage, the thickening of the corpus callosum, such that you have now not functionally progressed from it, is indeed unfortunate. There is a reason why atheists, when in condescension mode, refer to God or Allah as the Sky Daddy. You haven't progressed to the stage of being a fully autonomous being. You've taken the autonomy your parents ceded to you by degrees, and by degrees you've passed them on to a proxy. When you realised that Mummy and Daddy weren't all powerful, you applied that characteristic to that which you came to call God or Allah.
So the idea that I have to somehow give justification for something that I'm forced to believe, something that is normatively natural to the human mind, to me, this is irrational.
You're not forced to believe anything. You can choose to believe based on the limitations of your experience, or you can choose to take on new experiences with a genuinely open mind and let brain plasticity do its thing. Instead, you're bogged down in the doldrums of primacy, assuming that the first answer, or rather the byproduct of normative natural predisposition, is the best answer. It may have been the best answer out on the savannah 150,000 years ago when an assegai and fire-making tools were the height of technological sophistication and language and philosophy were still in their infancy, but none of those things are the case anymore. The products of human civilization as a whole have evolved more quickly than we have as individuals. We have the cognitive ability to recognize this, and because we are social creatures who can catalytically use each other's minds, we can transcend it.
And therefore I see this as a waste of time. In fact, this whole discussion regarding, rationality and justification for belief in God should have ended a long time ago.
I agree, it should have, so stop perpetuating it.
And for all of you out there saying this is a genetic fallacy or a naturalistic fallacy, I'm sorry, but no. I'm not arguing for the truth of believing in God or the actuality of God's existence. I'm simply arguing for the rational starting point and against this idea that somehow everything requires evidence.
So you're really using the supernatural as a rational starting point. You've said yourself that you're forced to believe it. What is rational about belief that you're obliged to hold? Here's a real-world example of why it's not. Children born in North Korea, until recently, were obliged to believe that Kim Jong-il is God, and may be forced to believe the same of Kim Jong-un. Given your own journey of supplying the name God to the agency you saw all around you, there would be no functional difference to a Korean child having given that same agency the name Kim Jong-il, with one important difference: TV appearances. A North Korean child had more reason to believe that Kim Jong-il was real, even if predisposed to imbue him with powers that aren't.
So yes, that is my answer to the question of whether or not there is evidence for God's existence or that evidence is required for God's existence. I refuse to answer it because it's not necessary. And it's not for me to prove to you that God does exist, unless you think that I should be proving every single thing that I'm naturally disposed to believing.
I don't think you should necessarily prove everything you're naturally predisposed to believe, but you might want to test your predispositions against reality once in a while for reasons previously given. Furthermore, as there is no evidence for God, it would absolutely fall to you to prove God's existence, especially if you want us to believe you or take your belief seriously. It's reasonable to assume that you do want us to believe, or you wouldn't put so much effort into debate on YouTube. That's evidence. Or are you just a Poe?
Which is impossible, because then that would bring into question the evidence itself.
No, it's okay. We've got this thing called the scientific method that can help you establish benchmarks and test evidence and stuff. It's brilliant. You'll love it.
Because for me to even provide you with evidence or to interpret evidence, I have to use the very same faculties that I have in order to justify that.
You do, yes, along with other people. Just like morality is achieved by consensus, so is reality, although we find that testing the outcomes for truth value is super handy. And before you jump on my use of morality, I think it's worth pointing out that our respective moralities will be functionally very similar, certainly on the important stuff, and I didn't arrive here via any god. I can justify my morals with evidence and logic, and I can use tools to test them for consistency on a near daily basis.
So if atheists wish for theists to take the red or the blue pill, maybe you guys should start justifying why everything we see is an illusion.
Not an illusion, no, just open to misinterpretation, as witness the fact that you're predisposed to seeing agency when there is none.
And if you think the theory of evolution does that, I'm sorry, but no. As a firm believer in the theory myself, I really don't see how it contradicts the idea that the world has agency or intention and purpose.
The theory of evolution can certainly give the appearance of agency, of course it can, if you misunderstand it, but the purpose is survival of species by adaptation to environmental factors, also known as life, but that doesn't require any agency above self. agency suggests an end product in mind, which, given that humans are still evolving, is not the case for a creature that was made in God's image. What agency or purpose is there to have rabbits having to pass fecal pellets in order to re-ingest them and have the contents pass through their digestive tract 3 or 4 times in order to get the full nutrient load? That's not a human revulsion at eating one's defecation, that's just disdain for the incredible inefficiency of it. What agency or purpose is there to the left and right esophageal branches of the vagus nerve passing below the right subclavian artery or the arch of the aorta and then back up to the esophagus? It's a stupid design for humans and outright absurd on a giraffe. Only evolution without agency explains this, because yes, bad design is indicative of a lack of a designer, even more so when you attribute omniscience to that designer.
But this is really more of a philosophical problem, which most atheists these days don't even care for. How many times have I heard most atheists say that philosophy is nonsense? It's not as good as science.
Most atheists don't care for philosophical questions. How do you figure that one? And how have you managed to poll most of the world's 750 million atheists? The very question of the existence of God is a philosophical one, by definition. Furthermore, science used to be called natural philosophy. Then there's the small matter of Karl Popper, a philosopher, I'm sure you've heard of him, who basically invented the scientific method as we know it. You keep mocking the predominant atheist leaning towards science, and now you want to venerate philosophy, from whence science came, from which science takes many of its processes, and to which science often looks.
It is not even counted as a real form of knowledge.
That's because philosophy isn't a form of knowledge, it's a process by which knowledge is gained and theories put forward and tested, often by logical deduction. Once hypotheses have been gained in this manner, it generally gets passed on to one of the ologies, which is to say science, for testing.
So many atheists I've talked to are not even ashamed of this fact, of being so willfully ignorant of philosophical discourse.
I don't know, Ali, you seem surprisingly ignorant of the philosophy that you're studying, or at least the logical underpinnings thereof at times.
I mean, talking to an atheist about philosophy is like talking to a young earth creationist about evolution. It just doesn't work.
Given your apparent misunderstanding, or rather mischaracterizing of evolution, I'd be really careful about mockery at this point.
And it makes you so frustrated to even talk to some of these individuals. It's like they honestly think science is the only way to get to anything. So to all those atheists out there that keep pushing this, I'm sorry. I guess I'm just too skeptical to accept your claims.
Skeptical? No, misuse of the term. The seeking of knowledge is obligatory for every Muslim, remember? To be skeptical, you wouldn't already have a position, or you would be testing that position's validity. As you've amply demonstrated, you have no desire to go outside your normative natural predispositions for any reason whatsoever, including the seeking of knowledge. You don't believe that the atheist position has any truth value, as compared to yours, but you don't seem to be subjecting yours to any scrutiny whatsoever. Or, to put it another way, I'm skeptical of your claim of skepticism, because skepticism is asking for evidence, not reactive disbelief. Again with the condescension. Anyway, in summation, your entire video, by any reasonable definition, is a cop-out. There were interesting twists and turns in your reasoning, but even that was often sunk by internal logic and fallacy issues. I try not to get bogged down in labelling the logical fallacies, as I think it can get in the way of the clarity of disputation. I have instead presented the reasons why it was a logical fallacy and left it at that, with I think 2 exceptions, one of which I will go into further now. The single biggest problem with your entire video, Ali, was the hypocrisy of both accepting and not accepting the scientific method and evidence as valuable depending on your need. This is cherry-picking, a fallacy, and a logic issue, law of non-contradiction, aka you can't have it both ways. You seem to be mischaracterizing what evidence is when you use it, as witness your misuse of the term skepticism, which is a demand for evidence. Further, the decision to ignore vast swathes of philosophical discourse on the nature of reality, which does indeed call into question personal experience and issues arising from theory of mind, is baffling given your field of study. Ali, and anyone else bored enough to watch this right through, I hope you found it thought-provoking, and I look forward to some spirited debate off the back of it. And, if we agree to disagree, at least we agree on something. One people, one planet, coexist.
Every human culture has a set of creation myths, but they're in the realm of mythology or religion or folklore, and they are, of course, all mutually inconsistent.